Have you ever paused, mid-sip of your tea perhaps, and wondered, what if? What if, for instance, those rather bolshy American colonists hadn't quite managed to win their little spat with Great Britain? Imagine a world where the United States of America simply wasn't. It sounds almost outlandish, a flight of fancy too far. So much of our modern world, our assumptions about democracy, freedom, and even the shape of our maps hinges on that American victory. The very idea of those plucky colonists with their homespun uniforms and fervent ideals taking on the might of the British Empire was, in its day, quite audacious. Many at the time on both sides of the Atlantic thought them quite mad. But what if their luck had run out? What if a crucial battle had gone the other way, or a key alliance had failed to materialize? History, you see, often turns on the tiniest of hinges. Consider the sheer, unadulterated nerve of it all, declaring independence from the most powerful empire the world had yet seen. It was a gamble of epic proportions, with the highest stakes imaginable: lives, fortunes, and the very future of a continent. We now view it through the lens of inevitable success, a story marching towards a known conclusion. But for those living through it, the outcome was anything but certain. If that revolutionary spark had been snuffed out, the consequences would not have been trivial. The ripples would have spread outwards, not just across North America, but through Europe, across empires, and down through the centuries. A world without Washington, Jefferson, or Franklin as founding fathers of a new nation, but perhaps as footnotes in a list of failed rebels. Let's explore that, shall we? To understand how it might have failed, we must first recall briefly how it all began. The mid-18th century saw Britain and its American colonies drifting apart. The colonists, having enjoyed a fair bit of autonomy, grew increasingly irked by British attempts to tighten control and, crucially, to tax them. No taxation without representation, they cried. Tensions simmered and then boiled over. Think of the Boston Tea Party. A rather dramatic way to voice displeasure over import duties. Then came Lexington and Concord in 1775, those famous first shots. The Continental Congress was formed, George Washington appointed to lead a rather ragtag army. These were farmers, merchants and artisans, fired by ideals of liberty, facing seasoned British redcoats and Hessian mercenaries. It was, by any sensible measure, an astonishingly uneven match. The colonists were driven by a powerful sense of injustice, yes, but passion alone rarely wins wars against superior firepower and training. What if the British had adopted a more cunning strategy early on, perhaps isolating New England more effectively? Or what if a decisive battle, say the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, had been a resounding British victory instead? Without French naval support and troops, Washington's task would have become monumentally harder, perhaps impossible. The early years were particularly perilous. Washington's army suffered numerous defeats and brutal winters, like the one at Valley Forge. A more sustained, ruthless British campaign, or a failure of colonial leadership to maintain unity and resolve, could easily have crushed the rebellion in its infancy. The flame of revolution, so bright in our history books, was in reality a fragile flicker, easily extinguished by a gust of misfortune or a well-aimed blow from the crown. Let us imagine, then, that the worst came to pass for the Continental Army. Perhaps a decisive defeat at Yorktown, not a victory, or a series of crushing blows that scattered Washington's forces beyond recovery. The leaders of the rebellion, men like Adams, Jefferson, Hancock, would have been in an extraordinarily precarious position. Branded as traitors, their lives and properties would be forfeit. Some might have been captured and faced the grim justice of the crown, a public hanging serving as a stark warning. Others might have fled, perhaps to France or Holland, living out their days in bitter exile. The immediate aftermath in the colonies would have been one of shock and despair for the patriots. For the loyalists, those who had remained faithful to King George III, it would be a moment of triumph and likely retribution. One can picture British troops garrisoned in major cities, martial law declared, and a period of score settling. Properties confiscated from rebels would be redistributed to loyal subjects. The dream of an independent republic would lie in ruins, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. The psychological impact on the colonial population cannot be overstated. Years of struggle, sacrifice, and fervent hope, all culminating in failure. This would breed a deep sense of disillusionment, perhaps even a lasting bitterness towards British rule, making the colonies a restive and difficult territory to govern. With the revolution quashed, there would be no United States Constitution, no Bill of Rights as we know them. That grand experiment in self-government, with its separation of powers and elected representatives, would simply not exist. Instead, the American colonies, or perhaps British North America as a more consolidated entity, would remain under the direct authority of the Crown and Parliament in London. One imagines a collective sigh of relief from the King, followed by a rather large headache concerning what to do next. How would Britain govern these chastened yet potentially still resentful subjects? They might attempt to return to the pre-1763 status quo, with colonial assemblies managing local affairs, but under a much tighter leash from London. Perhaps a viceroy or governor-general would be appointed, overseeing the entire region with significant powers. The colonists' demands for the rights of Englishmen would persist, but their bargaining position would be considerably weakened. Any representation in the Westminster Parliament would likely be minimal, if granted at all, a token gesture at best. The question of taxation, the very spark that ignited the revolution, would need to be addressed. Britain would still have war debts, now perhaps even larger from a more protracted conflict to suppress the rebellion. The colonies would be, well, colonies, firmly part of the imperial structure. One of the most profound social questions revolves around the institution of slavery. In our timeline, the United States grappled with slavery for decades, leading to a devastating civil war. Britain, however, abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833. If America had remained British, would slavery have ended there sooner and perhaps more peacefully? It's a compelling thought. Plantation owners in the southern colonies would have fiercely resisted, of course, but they would be resisting the might of the empire, not a federal government they partly controlled. Westward expansion is another fascinating area. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, which limited colonial settlement beyond the Appalachians to protect Native American lands, was a major grievance for the colonists. Had Britain remained in control, this policy might have been enforced more rigorously, or at least expansion would have been more orderly and centrally managed from London. This could have meant a vastly different fate for Native American nations, perhaps with larger, more secure territories, or perhaps just a different pattern of conflict and displacement. The social hierarchy would also be distinct. Loyalists, who in our history were often persecuted or driven into exile, many to Canada, would instead be the favoured class. They would likely dominate local government, business and society, their loyalty to the crown handsomely rewarded. Former patriots, if not imprisoned or exiled, would live under a cloud of suspicion, their opportunities limited. This could create a deeply divided society with simmering resentments just below the surface, or perhaps over generations, a gradual assimilation and acceptance of British identity. Culturally, British North America would likely hew much closer to the mother country. It would be a society that looked, sounded and felt much more like a slightly more rustic version of Britain itself. The failure of the American Revolution would have sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, dramatically altering the geopolitical landscape of Europe. The French monarchy under Louis XVI had invested heavily in supporting the American cause, both financially and militarily. This aid was crucial to the American victory. Without that success, and with Britain emerging stronger and less debt-ridden than it did historically, as it wouldn't have lost its valuable colonies in such a costly war, France would be in a considerably weaker position. Indeed, one of the most significant knock-on effects could be the French Revolution itself. The American example of a successful popular uprising against monarchy was a powerful inspiration for French revolutionaries. Moreover, the financial strain of the American War significantly worsened France's already dire economic situation, a key trigger for their own revolution in 1789. If the American Revolution failed, France would not have incurred those specific debts, and the ideological spark would be missing. Perhaps the French Revolution would be delayed, take a different form, or even be averted altogether. Spain and the Netherlands, who also opposed Britain during the American War of Independence, would similarly find themselves in a different strategic reality. A more powerful Britain, unchastened by colonial loss, would be a more formidable rival or ally. The balance of power in Europe, always a delicate dance, would tilt significantly in Britain's favour. The very spirit of revolutionary republicanism that swept through parts of the world in the late 18th and early 19th centuries would be dampened. The age of revolutions might have been far less revolutionary, or its course significantly altered, with profound implications for the development of political thought and governance worldwide. Without an independent United States, the British Empire in North America would be an immense, contiguous territory. What we know as Canada and the former 13 colonies would likely be administered as several large provinces or dominions. The influx of United Empire loyalists that shaped English-speaking Canada in our timeline would not occur in the same way, as they wouldn't be fleeing a victorious republic. Instead, British North America would simply be larger, richer and more populous, a jewel in the imperial crown, albeit a potentially restless one. This consolidated British power in North America would have significant implications for other imperial players. France would not have sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803 because there would be no United States to buy it. Would Louisiana remain French, or would a dominant Britain, perhaps after the Napoleonic Wars, if they still happened in the same way, eventually seize it? Similarly, Spanish territories like Florida and vast swathes of the American West would face a different kind of pressure, likely from a more directly expansionist British colonial administration rather than a young American republic. The global British Empire would be even more dominant. The resources, manpower and strategic position of an undivided North American holding would be immense. This could accelerate British influence in Asia, Africa and the Pacific. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," would ring even truer. Perhaps the pace of colonization elsewhere would quicken, or Britain might find itself overstretched managing such a vast and diverse global domain. Fast forward into the 19th and 20th centuries. Without the dynamic, often rambunctious influence of an independent United States, the world would be unrecognizably altered. American industrial growth, technological innovation, and westward expansion were defining features of the 19th century. Would a British North America, governed from afar, have experienced the same explosive development? Perhaps, but likely at a different pace and with different priorities, more aligned with imperial interests than with purely local or national ones. The great waves of immigration that shaped modern America might have been diverted or managed differently by British authorities. The melting pot ideal for all its complexities might not have emerged in the same way. What of global democracy? The American model, flawed as it was, served as an inspiration for democratic movements worldwide. Its absence would leave a significant void. Would parliamentary democracy within the British Empire eventually grant more self-rule to its colonies, including those in North America? Perhaps, but the path to self-determination might be longer and more fraught. Ultimately, the failure of the American Revolution would create a present that is almost impossible for us to truly imagine in all its detail. Our reality, it seems, was woven from that audacious gamble for independence.